Mr. Bilahari Kausikan, Chairman of Middle East Institute and former Ambassador at Large, Professor Tan Eng Chai, President of NUS, Professor Ho Teck Wah, Deputy President and Provost of NUS, distinguished guests, students, welcome to this public lecture. We were delighted when Mr. Kausikan offered to give a series of talks. We believe that this ties in very nicely with FASS's pedagogical principles, which is really to test everything that we teach in the classroom with what goes on in the real world, and to have that kind of fruitful dialogue, which we think is going to help us with our mission of preparing graduates who are prepared to make a difference in society and in the rest of the world. Right? So this is a mix, just to explain, this is a mixed audience. We have about 100 political science students, a number of other students from elsewhere in the university, and members of the public. Right? So we hope that the question and answer session will be fruitful and exciting. You will enjoy yourselves during the talk as well. Right? May I just be a housekeeping? Can I please remind everyone to put their devices to silent at this time? And without further ado, I invite Mr. Kausikan to address us.
Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this lecture. I hope you don't regret coming. I've entitled this first lecture, How to Think About Foreign Policy. Can you hear me, by the way? Is this mic working? Okay. I've entitled it How to Think About Foreign Policy. And for some of you, this may bring to mind the old saying about grandmothers and eggs. And what I have to say about some of the basic considerations and concepts that underlie our foreign policy, in fact, ought to be obvious. But I do not think they are really as deeply understood as they ought to be. Now, since I'll be dealing mainly with concepts, this lecture will also come across as somewhat abstract. This lecture sets out the broad framework within which some issues of importance to Singapore will be analyzed in subsequent lectures. And I trust the application of the concepts, or the application of what I have to say tonight, will become evident in subsequent lectures, if you are foolish enough to attend them. The aim of this lecture, and in fact all the lectures, however, is not to tell you what to think about this issue or that issue. No, naturally, what I think about some of these issues will come across in these lectures. But you can take or leave my opinions as you please. You should form your own opinions. My aim is somewhat more limited, but perhaps more ambitious. And that is to persuade you to adopt a particular mode of thought when thinking about foreign policy, when you are forming your own opinions. In other words, these lectures are not about what to think, it is how to think. Now, making judgments on foreign policy is far from a straightforward matter. Of course, thinking in a particular way by no means guarantees accurate judgments. But unless you are exceptionally lucky, an inappropriate mode of thought almost always leads to wrong judgments. Yet, people who will be reluctant to question their doctor or their dentist or even their astrologer do not hesitate to confidently assert opinions on foreign policy. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, you know. I am not arguing that foreign policy should be left only to experts, many of whose opinions on close examinations often turn out to be questionable. And by the way, that includes my own opinions. For reasons that I hope will become clear in the course of this lecture, the probability of being wrong is higher when dealing with foreign policy than in other policy domains. Experts, no less than the general public, are subject to the same probability of error. But in any case, whether expert or not, the influence of public opinion on foreign policy making is inevitable. In any democracy, however that rather protean term is defined, the opinions of citizens matter. and a sound and sustainable foreign policy, always and everywhere, must rest on a foundation of a stable domestic political consensus. This is obvious. It is also obvious that a small city-state cannot insulate itself from the external environment, cannot survive, let alone prosper, without engaging with the external environment. But for much of Singapore's short independent history, 54 years is not a long time in the life of a nation. 54 years may seem unbelievably ancient to those of you who are still undergraduates, but believe me, once you reach 50, you think that, it's very young still, Okay? For most of our short independent history, and indeed for much of my career in the Singapore Foreign Service, most Singaporeans were too preoccupied with making a living to be very interested in foreign policy. That was quite convenient for foreign services officers of that generation, my generation, a couple of which I see sitting in the audience. Most Singaporeans were content to leave foreign policy to the government. Having a job and a full stomach were more compelling concerns, and most people were too busy to connect the dots between their immediate concerns and foreign policy. The key external and internal challenges of that period were, moreover, starkly existential. And there was a visceral public understanding of them, even if they did not pay much attention to details. Well, those days are gone. They are over. Most Singaporeans, like most people everywhere, are still not particularly interested in foreign policy, except sporadically. But Singaporeans are today generally better educated and more exposed to a broader range of information and opinion. And there is now a group of Singaporeans, the number is still not overly large, but it is bound to grow. Anyway, there's a group of Singaporeans who have become more interested in foreign policy and insist on their own voice and agency on foreign policy matters, irrespective of what their day jobs may be. They do not hesitate to speak out, so far mainly on social media. This is, of course, their right as citizens, and more interest in foreign policy is to be welcomed. But the quality of internet discussion is not noticeably high. Too often it is puerile, as it usually is everywhere. Nevertheless, the influence of social media will grow, not diminish. It is a new political reality that cannot be ignored. And at least minimally, foreign policy literate public is all the more necessary. Now, our domestic politics is becoming more complex. The political space is becoming more crowded. Ideally, domestic foreign policy should stop at water's edge. This is an ideal fully realized nowhere on earth. Interdependence is everywhere, erasing the always artificial distinction between domestic and foreign policies. And it is inevitable that our foreign policy will become the subject of political debate. The range of foreign policy options on any issue for a small city-state is never going to be very broad. There is nevertheless always room for debate. What kind of debate, though? Not all debates are born equal, Healthy foreign policy debates ought to be within nationally agreed parameters or frameworks of shared values and assumptions. Establishing such a framework, again, crucially requires a minimally foreign policy literate public. And going forward, such a public will make it more likely that those in the political arena who may be tempted to use foreign policy for narrow partisan advantage, and there are already some, will find the willpower to resist the temptation. Why? Very simple, because the one thing most politicians fear is to be made a fool of in public. Well, Singapore today is not the Singapore of the 60s, 70s, 80s, or even the 90s. We are more successful with a wider external network. Our international reputation is high. The sense of crisis that permeated the early years of independence has dissipated. We feel safer. And in many ways, we are indeed safer. Although most Singaporeans do not spend much time thinking about why this is so and what we need to do to keep it so. Feeling safer, we have higher expectations, even on issues once considered peripheral. Having higher expectations, we may be losing a sense of perspective. Now, some years ago, an Israeli friend of mine who had never previously visited Singapore happened to be here during a major MRT breakdown. He was puzzled by the public reaction. He thought it was extreme, almost as if it was an existential national crisis. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not making light of disruptions to public transport, and neither was he, my friend, I mean. Obviously, this is not a good thing, and we should do something to minimize disruptions, and we are trying to do so. But he told me that if this was the worst that we have to face, we are a lucky country. He was too polite to explicitly say what I knew was on his mind. What was on his mind was, although unspoken, clear enough. It was, if this is how Singaporeans react to a train breakdown, how would they react to a really serious national crisis? I don't know whether any of you have been to Israel. I go there quite often. Now, a casual visitor to Israel may conclude that Israelis are constantly quarreling with each other, as indeed they usually are. But whatever their disagreements or political opinions, I have yet to meet an Israeli who does not understand the existential threats confronting their country, which, like us, is quite a prosperous and successful country. I like to joke with Israeli friends that only a stupid outsider interferes when Israelis quarrel. They will immediately stop quarreling and beat you up so that they can continue to quarrel in peace. Now, Israel may not be the best example to use to make my point. We do not face the same level of external threat, and not by chance, but because of successful policies, foreign policies. But my friend had a valid point. Some Singaporeans have drawn simplistic conclusions from Singapore's success, which too often is taken for granted as if it was a law of nature. Something that we now have the luxury of indulging in debate for debate's sake as a form of entertainment or to seek attention. To others, stressing the fundamentals of foreign policy seems fusty or intended only to keep the PAP in power. To yet others, solutions to external problems are very obvious. Why can't anybody else see it? And if their preferred solutions are not immediately embraced, it's only due to the obtuseness or intransigence of the government. Yes, we are successful, but in reality, we are not any less dependent on the vagaries and vicissitudes of a world that is now changing at a faster pace and in more unpredictable ways. The world is still dangerous, though not in the same way as in the past. Economic success has enhanced our interdependence with a more uncertain regional and global environment. And unless there is a total collapse of global order, which I think is rather unlikely, interdependence will continue to deepen. Accordingly, our external challenges will become more complex and their management more complicated. There are often no definitive solutions to complex issues. Not everything desirable is possible. Yet at the same time, the acceleration of change raises the cost of missteps or slow responses. And more than ever before, a healthy foreign policy debate requires a grasp of complexity, an appreciation of nuance, a capacity for wholly clinical analysis, and a sense of what is realistically achievable in any particular situation. This is what I mean by being foreign policy literate. We are not there yet. On the contrary, as the environment becomes more unpredictably complex, too much analysis and opinion becomes simplistic. The human mind, I think, craves certainty and thus simplifies complexity, unconsciously seeking out comfortably familiar patterns, irrespective of whether or not they are appropriate. And this is particularly so with regard to the key strategic issue of our times, US-China relations. This is an issue that attracts far too much simplistic, indeed sentimental thought. I will deal with this in my fourth lecture. This is so, this tendency to a simplistic and sentimental thought is so even among many of those whose profession is to understand and explain, academics, journalists, and professional pundits of various kinds. Even some present and former members of the public service, including the Foreign Service, do not seem to me to have fully internalized the fundamentals. Of course, we should not seek complexity for the sake of complexity, to show how clever we are, a failing to which a certain type of intellectual is particularly prone. Occam's razor is a useful tool to wield when thinking about foreign policy. But it is not always easy to know which are the key assumptions to be retained and which should be discarded. That itself requires a grasp of complexity. Simple explanations are not the same thing as simplistic explanations. Getting to the heart of a foreign policy issue is never easy because more often than not, they are swaddled with plausible irrelevancies. The Singapore government, more than most other governments, has taken pains to explain the considerations that underlie certain foreign policy issues. Perhaps not always very well, and perhaps of late not enough. Still, there is no want of effort. But it is not possible for the government to explain every issue to the people as clearly and frankly as it may want to, because, to speak plainly, can cause adverse reactions in other countries, compounding the original issue or creating new issues. Yet, without adequate public understanding, a domestic consensus on an issue is hard to sustain, again compounding the problem or creating new issues. And this is a worry, to me at least, given the current situation in Malaysia. Now, this is not a conundrum peculiar to Singapore. It's a dilemma faced by all responsible governments. But it's far more acute in a new country whose people have only a short shared history. In all countries, whatever the overt differences of opinion, and however fierce the differences, their peoples instinctively and perhaps unconsciously know the most fundamental and vital things about themselves and their environment. This understanding has been indelibly imprinted on them by centuries of often bitter and bloody shared history. In such countries, the government does not have to explain everything. Do we have a shared framework? If someone interferes in our internal affairs, will we immediately stop and beat him up so we can debate in peace? I hope so. And I think we probably will on some issues, depending on who tries to meddle. But I am not yet confident that this will be our reaction on every issue or to every country. We have far more of a shared framework today than we had in 1965. Singaporeans, particularly younger Singaporeans, do now hold some key values and assumptions in common, and most hold them sincerely. And this is a positive development. But we should not assume that the trajectory of this development will be a straight line, or that it will continue to develop naturally along the present trajectory without governmental intervention. We call one type of such interventions national education. The use of the Internal Security Act is another type of intervention. I do not think we intervene in the first way very effectively, and the second type of intervention has always been used with great care and sparingly. There are, of course, other types of interventions as well. But the need for interventions of whatever type is a serious issue that I will return to in my last lecture. The problem arises because the probability is that since our common values are new, only 54 years old, they are not yet deeply rooted, even if sincerely held. And sincerity is not always to be assumed. I suspect that for some, it is much more a matter of political correctness than deep conviction. In any case, since public understanding of our foreign policy fundamentals is generally shallow and our values are still new, they are still malleable and subject to manipulation. Deception, misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda, fake news or influence operations are the current terms of art, have since time immemorial been instruments of foreign policy. And even when not actively conducting such operations, all countries routinely wrap up their intentions in high-sounding principles, which too often are taken at face value by the public, by our public. A healthy skepticism and an appreciation of the distinction between what our first Foreign Minister, Mr. S. Rajaratnam, once described as the foreign policy of words and the foreign policy of deeds is another essential part of foreign policy literacy. I think it will be at least another generation before we can be reasonably confident that our common values will be sufficiently deeply rooted to resist such influences. I hope I'm wrong. Still, given some of the broad global, political, economic, technological, and sociological trends that are generating centrifugal forces from which we cannot be insulated, it would be prudent never to let down our guard. Since I see no signs of these trends abating, perhaps our common values will never be entirely unassailable. A further complication is the vocabulary we use to describe, to discuss, and explain foreign policy. We use some words because we have no other words or because to use other formulations would be clumsy. Political science jargon comes to mind. But the same words do not always convey the same meaning to different people or carry very different connotations in the foreign policy domain. I'll give you two key examples. Others will become apparent in the course of these lectures. Now, all countries commonly describe bilateral relations with other countries as friendly or otherwise. Friend, in its various synonyms and antonyms and their grammatical derivatives, is one of the most frequently used words in foreign policy discussions. It is axiomatic that Singapore will be friends with any country that wants to be friends with us. But what does that really mean? In personal relations, to call someone a friend describes an emotional connection. In international relations, it conveys nothing more than a convergence of national interests. Interests inevitably differ from issue to issue and change over time. In your personal life, what would you think of a person who is only friendly when he or she wants something from you, or only when convenient to them? Probably you will think of such people as selfish or unreliable. Certainly not as a friend. But foreign policy is intrinsically, always and everywhere, the pursuit of national self-interest. When Mr. Trump talks about putting America first, he's not saying anything particularly unusual, although he's saying it in an extreme way. Now, I don't mean to suggest that no country or no people have never ever bestirred themselves to a great or noble effort or sacrifice for the sake of some transcendent moral principle or cause. Of course, they sometimes have, but usually only on Sundays. Most days of the week, foreign policy is the pursuit of the national interest. This does not mean that we must always define our national interest in a narrowly transactional manner, and we do not do so. In fact, the criticism of Trump putting America first is not that he's saying anything unusual, but he's defining American interests in too narrow a manner. And we don't do it that way. I mean, we are not, every country is transactional, but we don't have to be always narrowly transactional, and we are not in Singapore anyway. But whether broadly or narrowly defined, it is still our national interest and nothing else. Another commonly used word is diplomacy. In everyday usage, it conveys the meaning of being pleasant, agreeable, or tactful. And a diplomat is someone with these qualities. Now, from time to time, I am described as an undiplomatic diplomat. I take it as a compliment, and not because I am exceptionally conceited or thick-skinned. My friends, I use the term in its personal sense, mean it affectionately. Others may only betray their ignorance of what diplomacy really entails. Diplomacy is the process whereby the national interest is advanced or defended, preferably by being pleasant, agreeable, and tactful, but if necessary, by any appropriate means. What is appropriate may well entail being uncompromising, being tough, unyielding, blunt, or even rude. Some anonymous sage, probably an experienced diplomat, once semi-jokingly but not inaccurately described a diplomat as someone who never unintentionally insults another person. In extremis, what is appropriate to protect or defend the national interests may entail the threat or use of force. War and diplomacy are not alternatives. They are very different points. They are just different points on a spectrum of possibilities, different tools in one toolkit. Only the most superficial sort of diplomat, and there are too many of them, including a few, unfortunately, in Singapore, only the most superficial sort of diplomat thinks that being pleasant, agreeable, or tactful are ends in themselves. Let me tell you a story. During the Second World War, Winston Churchill wanted the British ambassador to Spain, a gentleman that was somewhat unfortunately named Samuel Hoare, to press General Franco to release British pilots who had been shot down but escaped from France to Spain and detained in Spain. The ambassador protested that to do so would ruin his relations with Franco. "Stuff," said Winston Churchill. I rather suspect that he may have used a pithier and more forceful word, but stuff is what history politely recorded. "Stuff your relations with Franco," Churchill is reported as having replied, "What do you think they are for?" The national interest is the central organizing concept for the formulation of foreign policy and the practice of diplomacy. From it derives almost everything else. This is probably generally understood even by those who take only a casual interest in foreign policy. It's not a difficult concept to grasp in broad terms. But a broad understanding of the idea of the national interest begs a crucial question. Once we get past generalities like survival or prosperity and their like, which prescribe nothing particularly useful for policy, how do we determine what do we need to do to survive or prosper in particular situations? And that's the crucial question. Now, answers to this questions, or this type of question, must be sought on two levels. At the first level, all countries have institutional procedures and bureaucratic processes to determine the national interests, and these processes can be incredibly tedious, as anybody who has served in any foreign ministry will tell you. Anyway, they have these institutional procedures, these bureaucratic processes, to determine the national interest in what, for want of a better word, I shall call specific issues. Examples of specific issues include how should we position ourselves in a given set of circumstances? What should be our policy on a particular issue? How do we respond to a request or a demand from one country or another? What tactics or arguments do we adopt to most effectively put across our position? In principle, answers to this category of specific foreign policy issues are relatively straightforward. And they are often largely, though seldom entirely, technical in nature. And they can be dealt with through the usual institutional and bureaucratic processes, provided, of course, that the institutions work as they are intended to work. The popular understanding of foreign policy generally stops at this level. Now, I said this category of questions is relatively straightforward. Relatively straightforward does not, of course, necessarily mean easy. Although, as I earlier pointed out, the range of options for a small city-state are never very broad, there are always choices to be made, and the choices are seldom clear-cut. Nor are specific issues or even technical matters ever devoid of political context. Answers to such issues are thus always situational and conditional. And herein lies the complexity of decision-making, particularly at a time such as we are now experiencing, when the external environment is in a state of more than usual flux and more than usual uncertainty. It follows that there are no final or definitive answers even to specific questions, except perhaps the least consequential. You know, how to set a table plan for dinner, you know, okay, there's a specific answer, there's a clear-cut answer. In fact, people do quarrel over that. Even that, people will find things to quarrel about if they want to. But more often, or very often, foreign policy is a series of responses to changing and unpredictable circumstances. Decisions often have unexpected consequences that beget new challenges. Policy is often a continual process of adjustment and improvisation and evolves from contingency to contingency in which chance and serendipity play a greater role than policymakers or analysts may care to acknowledge. This is so for all countries, big and small, although it is all too easy for big countries to delude themselves that they are in full context of the situation. A moment's thought will give you all many examples, some not very far away. The world, or at least that part of it, relevant to the conduct of foreign policy, is very difficult to understand holistically, even if it is not entirely unknowable. The world of foreign policy is not the material world that conforms to the laws of physics, and those laws are themselves no longer as certain as we once thought. The world of foreign policy is a socially and politically constructed world of human beings, a complex world. At this point, a short digression to make an essential distinction is needed. The complex and the complicated are not synonyms, although they are often carelessly used as such. A car is a very complicated piece of machinery with thousands of different moving parts that interact in precise ways. But it is not complex and hence essentially predictable. Unless there is some mechanical defect, if we correctly engage the gears and press the accelerator, the car will predictably always move forward. Man is a sentient animal. We think and are aware of our thoughts. Being sentient and having the gift or curse of reason, we have ideas which have material effects on our behavior. We react to changes in our environment, which includes our understanding or misunderstanding, because reason is not omniscience, our understanding or misunderstanding of other people's ideas and actions by modifying our own ideas and actions. By doing so, we change other people's ideas and behavior, which again changes our own responses, and so on ad infinitum. The foreign policy world is therefore an endlessly shifting kaleidoscope of possibilities. The foreign policy world is therefore not just complicated, but complex. The external environment is essentially unpredictable. And that's why, as I said at the beginning, all foreign policies are especially prone to error. I do not want to exaggerate the point or push it too far. But it does make political science, and indeed social science in general, something of an oxymoron. I do not believe in theories of historical, political, or economic development, or indeed not too much in theories of almost anything. But at the same time, history is also not just the random unfolding of one damn thing after another. There are always broad social, political, economic, and technological forces at play that shape international developments. These forces are identifiable, and their trajectory can be tracked, at least in broad strokes. They circumscribe the range of possibilities and thus the unpredictability of human volition. As Karl Marx once wrote, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. Now, small countries are largely price takers in a complex international system. But the intrinsic complexity of the foreign policy world also means that small countries are never entirely without agency. It is precisely because the foreign policy domain is complex and defined by an endlessly shifting kaleidoscope of possibilities, there is always something that can be done, if only we have the wit to recognize it and the courage to act on what we recognize. There is no action without risk. And sometimes the biggest risk is to try and avoid all risk. You must have heard of this gentleman by the name of Thucydides. Well, Thucydides' dictum, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, is at best only partially true. It's a very crude form of realism. And crude realism is sometimes not very realistic. Too often, it is just an alibi for unwillingness to take risks. Of course, the possibility of error being ever present, we must also have the agility of mind to recognize mistakes or unintended consequences and try something else before it's too late. What do you do when you find yourself in a hole? Says the old saying. It's very obvious. Stop digging. If something is wrong, don't do it. Change. Try something else. No. Accepting risks does not mean we need to be reckless. And it's a very fine balance. And the exercise of agency in foreign policy thus requires very fine judgment. That kind of judgment entails a nuanced and clinical understanding of the interplay between the personal and the impersonal, between the subjective and the objective, and thus of the range within which we can act. This kind of judgment is, in my view, much more akin to artistic intuition than science, and can only be taught to a limited extent. More important is habituation within a community or tradition of practice. This allows the accumulation of experience, including the experience of being wrong and learning from error, and hence the acquisition of instincts. The idea of community and tradition, remember I said habituation between a community or tradition or practice. And this idea of community or tradition implies that these instincts are never entirely individual, but acquired around some shared core. And this brings me to the second level on which the concept of the national interest should be understood. Now, nothing I have said about foreign policy as improvisation or the necessity of continual adjustment is intended to suggest that foreign policy is mere aimless drifting. The imperative of continual adjustment to a changing external environment does not absolve us from the responsibility of setting a direction and never losing sight of it, even as we tack hither and thither to avoid dangers or to seize opportunities. Direction is set by what I had earlier called a framework of common assumptions and shared values. The most vital responsibility of foreign policy decision makers as they deal with specific issues is to ensure that nothing they do from day to day will irrevocably compromise these shared assumptions and values. That framework of assumption and values is the core national interest, the second level on which that idea of national interest should be understood. All countries, even when at war, hold some interests and norms in common. Otherwise, diplomacy would be impossible and terms such as international system or international order would be meaningless. Core interests, by contrast, define how a particular country, and only that country, thinks of itself and distinguishes itself from other countries. It encapsulates the essence of a country's identity. Our distinct identity is the fundamental basis of the autonomy that allows us to be ourselves in the midst of interdependence. Foreign and domestic policies, and ultimately war and peace, converge in the core interests. The greater the uncertainty in our external environment, the more vital is the responsibility of protecting the core national interests. It is impossible to maintain direction while navigating uncertainty unless you know who you are and, if need be, are willing to fight to preserve who you are. Otherwise, while we may remain formally independent, have our own flag, sing Majulah Singapura, and have our own seat and vote in the United Nations, our autonomy, the ability to determine our own destiny, may well be hijacked by other countries' interests and irrevocably compromised. What is Singapore's core national interest? How is it derived? What must we do to protect it? I will deal with these questions in more detail in my second and third lectures. For now, suffice to say that our core national interest stems from our political history, specifically from the multidimensional political contests that led to merger with Malaysia, but after a few years made it impossible for us to remain part of Malaysia, and in our subsequent independent political history. The general point is that the definition of the core national interest is an inescapably political process. It is never just a matter of institutional or bureaucratic decision-making. More than 50 years ago, David Easton described politics as, and I quote, the authoritative allocation of values for a society. Now, I don't know whether his books are prescribed these days. Probably not. 60 years is a long time. But I've never found a better description of politics or of how the core national interest is determined. Singapore is the only sovereign state outside Greater China with an ethnic Chinese majority population. We live in a region where the overseas Chinese are not always a welcome minority and generally occupy a politically subordinate position even if their economic influence is often larger than their numbers. But although the Chinese are the majority in Singapore, by a conscious political choice made in 1965, we organized ourselves horizontally on the basis of multiracial meritocracy, which is a short-form term for a whole cluster of values and assumptions. Our meritocracy is not perfect, of course. There is no perfection on earth. Maybe there is some in heaven if there is a heaven. But we take this idea seriously. It is not just a pragmatic arrangement, it is a normative value. It is how we believe our society ought to be organized. This normative organizing principle makes us unique. It is what makes Singapore, Singapore, and is the foundation of the social compact on which independent Singapore rests. This is the fundamental basis of all we have achieved since independence. It is our core national interest. Many Singaporeans may not fully realize just how unique is this organizing principle. Every other country in Southeast Asia, without exception, organizes itself vertically on the basis of a formal or informal ethnic and religious hierarchy. The most obvious example being Malaysia, but every other country. There is no exception in Southeast Asia. We can talk about it during question and answer if you like. In fact, hierarchy is the norm in all of East Asia and South Asia. Ethnic and religious hierarchy is even being reasserted by a substantial number of people in several Western liberal democracies. And this is the root cause of the emergence of right-wing populist movements in those countries. Singapore is thus something of an anomaly or outlier, and must also be anomaly outlier in Southeast Asia, and must always be something of an outlier. A small city-state with no natural resources or hinterland within its sovereign territory cannot take its relevance for granted. Small city-states have no intrinsic relevance to the international system. Nothing small states do in the international system requires them to be sovereign. Small states could well perform much the same functions without being sovereign. And that is why, historically, small city-states have not survived for very long. If we aim to beat the odds, the historical odds, we must understand that relevance is an artifact created by human endeavor and political choice. Having been created, relevance must be maintained by human endeavor and political choice. And how do we do it? Well, there's no magic formula for creating relevance. What makes you relevant in one situation may be irrelevant in another situation, and in any case, changes over time. But at bottom, maintaining relevance means preserving our uniqueness. It derives from our core national interests as I have described it. We cannot be just an ordinary Southeast Asian country like any other. We have to be extraordinary. Otherwise, why would anyone want to deal with us rather than with larger countries whose size endows them with intrinsic relevance, most of whom also have rich natural resources? But being extraordinary does not necessarily make us universally loved. This cannot be helped. The management of this paradox lies at the heart of our foreign policy. I had earlier said that I did not think that our core values are deeply rooted. And this was forcefully brought home in July 2017 when Kishore Mahbubani, then the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and a former Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, published an article in the Straits Times in which he argued, and I quote, "Small states must always behave like small states." The article, and quite rightly so, aroused a storm of controversy. Several senior diplomats, myself included, rebutted it. And more important than the rebuttals by the senior diplomats, with different degrees of directness, so did the Minister of Home Affairs, so did the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and so did the Prime Minister. Why such heavy guns? This was not, as some thought, just another academic debate. If it was, nobody would bother. Nor was it just disagreement over the tactics to be adopted over what I had earlier called specific issues, in this case, the South China Sea. Certainly, it was not because of personal animosity or any other ad hominem reason. Whether he intended it or not, and personally I do not think he did it wittingly, Kishore had deployed arguments that struck at the very heart of Singapore's core interests. And if these arguments had been allowed to pass without robust and authoritative rebuttal, they could have undermined what makes Singapore Singapore. Furthermore, he had done so at a time when our core interests were already under strong external pressure. Regardless of intention, this was totally unacceptable. that he was an experienced diplomat only made it all the more egregious. I remind you of the controversy not to pick at anyone's old scabs. I do so only because I do not think the nature of that controversy is sufficiently understood. If our core national interest, which was established by conscious political choice, is to be redefined, it should be changed by another conscious political choice, for which the advocates of change must take political responsibility. It should not be changed by inadvertence or sleight of hand under the guise of mere tactical adjustment. The arguments deployed were, moreover, deeply flawed, both in substance and in the mode of thought from which they were derived. These were not mistakes specific only to one individual. The arguments of those who sought to defend Kishore against what they believed was unreasonable attack displayed much the same mistakes. Now, the numbers of Kishore's defenders were not insignificant. So the mistakes are shared by a not insignificant number of people. If we are to develop the foreign policy literate public needed to sustain a domestic consensus on a sound foreign policy, it is therefore imperative that the flaws and dangers of those arguments be widely understood. The remaining lectures in this series will try to expose those flaws by contextualizing the article's main arguments within some key foreign policy issues. Now, Kishore's article is not the main theme of these lectures. It's only a convenient means of conveying larger points about how to think about foreign policy. But if I were to give a title to this series of lectures that would characterize Singapore's foreign policy in a single sentence, that single sentence would be, why small states should not behave like small states.